Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Adventure Box podcast. This is Zach Edwards with Historical Conquest, the sponsor of this podcast, and the one that brings you Historical Conquest, the physical game. Now, we also have a digital game that is out on the Zogos gaming platform. So stay tuned for that. Can't wait to tell you more about it. But what I'm going to be doing is this week, we are just doing an introduction to both Age of Exploration on Mondays and Wednesdays. And then on Tuesdays and Thursdays, we're going to be doing Ancient Civilizations, starting off with Africa. Now, the reason why Africa is so important to understand, and now what's the most important to understand for at least those that live in America, is the American continent and the ancient civilizations that were there. That's why we started off there. Now we're going to Africa, because this is believed to be the start of humanity. Is it true? Not sure. Again, because as we talk about every time, there's a difference between fact and theory. And this is the best we have. So, starting off, last week we talked mostly about the the Paleolithic era. This is anywhere from 300,000 BC to about 10,000 BC. Now this time, and again, we are talking about, let me bring this up. We're talking about Africa. So here we are in the United States, and we're talking about this area over here in Africa. Now, it's hard to tell exactly what happened because we can only find fragments of archaeological finds all over. Again, there's a lot of them, but there's still fragments of information that come from each archaeological find. Every archaeological find that we find is one more chance to actually understanding what happened in Africa. Because again, most parts of Africa didn't have writings until the Europeans came down. Those that did have some writings, or actually, whether the Europeans coming down or actually the caliphates coming over from Islam in the 400, 500, 600 BC. Sorry, AD. Okay, so let's go more into Africa this time. So let's talk about the Mesolithic era. This is the next era. This is from about 10,000 BC to 8,000 BC. Now, in the Mesolithic era, this is right before what? This is 2,000 years before the Neolithic. What does that mean? Mesolithic is where people were still wandering around as tribes, wandering around and trying to find a way of life. They were trying to survive, following the herds. Now, the Mesolithic was traveling around. The Paleolithic was even before that, before they actually created these entities or these tribes, these groups, and they were basically just trying to figure out life. This is potentially Neolithic era, or sorry, not Neolithic, Neanderthal, and up to humanoid. So what we know about that area, sorry, I should have brought in some water. What we know about that era is actually fairly unclear. Again, because we can only find things that we get from archaeological finds or scientific finds with things like climate and, well, not really much in Africa. But what is interesting, so again, Mesolithic, 10,000 BC to 8,000 BC. What happened 8,000 BC? This is the Neolithic era. This is when tribes started to solidify their territories and started coming together as tribes instead of individual families wandering. So they solidify, they stay in this one place. Now, in northern Africa, what do we know of northern Africa? What is up there? What's the first thing that comes to your mind? Yep. If you're thinking the Sahara Desert, you're absolutely right. That's the first thing that comes to most people's mind. So, what about the Sahara Desert? What is the Sahara Desert? It's a desert, right? It is a desert where there is no life whatsoever. That's actually not true. Okay, so if you zoomed up in these maps, you will actually find areas where there are actually civilizations, and there are encroachments of vegetation all throughout the area. So there are small encroachments of these vegetations. Could it have ever been all green? Think of it. Could the Sahara Desert have never actually existed for a time? The answer is yes. Actually, there is a theory, again, theory, that between 10,000 BC and 7,000 BC, the Sahara was actually green. That whole area was green. The whole continent was green. And they had tsunamis of rain wash through it. And interesting enough, they actually say that during that time, it was a planetary shift, that the planet actually shifted and provided all of this vegetation, all this water to grow this vegetation. And it was rich, thick soil, and tribes lived throughout it. Again, during the Neolithic era. So there was a lot of tribes that were in the Sahara Desert area without the desert. What happened after 700 BC? Or sorry, 7,000 BC? Well, all of a sudden, it started to dry up. Was there another planetary shift? And why haven't we seen a shift now? I don't know. How is it that we had 3,000 years of planetary shift? Like, there was a shift 10,000 BC to 7,000 BC. But between 7,000 BC, or at least whenever it became less green, which is probably about 5,000 BC, it's 7,000 years later. No planetary shift to make it green again. So interesting. So how do archaeologists actually know about the Green Sahara? And we're going to talk about this next week. But this takes one topic off of learning about it next week. There are actual archaeological finds under the Sahara Desert of green, lush residue. Green, lush remains of animals, of grass, of trees, of tropics in the middle of the Sahara Desert. And there are multiples of these. We talk about a few of them in next week's chapter. But the Sahara Desert, so what happened to all those tribes that were there? Again, remember, this is the Neolithic era, so there's not many tribes. I mean, there's not a huge amount of tribes at this point. Well, what happens? Well, if there's no water, if you're not getting any rain, you're either going to die off, and the environment's the complete genocidal maniac of that. Excuse me, sorry. Or they moved, they dispersed, they tried to find the quickest place to water. They weren't used to no water, though. So you have to imagine that a lot of people just died of famine and thirst. So they traveled with the herds. The herds got smart. A lot of them left. A lot of them probably stayed, too. So some of the tribes followed the herds until the herds died off. And they're like, what do we do? Now, again, very primitive people. How primitive? We're not quite sure. Again, all their technology was based on survival and not thriving in entertainment like us. Because I got to say, we put a lot of time and effort into our entertainment, less into our survival nowadays because we have so much abilities to do the research, or we're already surviving. So what happened? Well, let's go back a little bit further. Around 70,000 BC, the theory is that people migrated out of Africa past what would become Egypt and up into Europe and the Middle East and such. That was 70,000 BC. That's 60 years before this, or at least 65,000 years before this. Then we have the Neolithic era. The Neolithic era, we have a thriving northern Africa. Very green. Supposedly 70,000 BC, it was not green. Because the planetary shift, it became green. So the people were loving it, which is why they actually wanted to settle. Again, another reason why people became Neolithic, in the sense that they started to establish permanent locations is because they could. They didn't have to travel long distances for herds. After the herds were all around them at the time. So the pictures of Africa that you see, the tall grasses and the antelope and the elephants and the whatever traveling around, that was most likely up in northern Africa. People settled. Then the rains go away, the water goes away, the herds go away, whether dying off or moving. The people move with them. And where'd they go? They went to the east and they went to the west. And some went to the north and others to the south. No one was settled in that area. So what happens when you start moving into other people's territories? Do they welcome you with open arms? Well, maybe some of them. What would happen most of the time? Yeah, you'd be in battle. It would be a war. And so there was a lot of fighting during this time because people were trying to establish themselves, and then something like their homes drying up would happen. And so they'd have to move. This is just one of the dramatic things that actually happens this time. What also happens, and you're going to learn about this more next week, but they're able to figure out that, hey, maybe we don't have to move with the herds. We've set up this place that we want to keep. Why don't we keep the herds with us and farm them? And so in Africa, they put up barriers. They collected the herds and they raised them. They had baby, I don't know all the species of animals there. Maybe I should do that. Actually, next week we are going to go through that. But they domesticated some of these animals. What else did they do? They learned different ways of agriculture as well. And this is just the start of this era. Actually, this is around the end of the Neolithic era, when they found out they needed to do some of these things in order to survive. So the next era after that is about 4000 BC to about 3000 BC. And this is called the Chalcolithic era. The Chalcolithic era was a time just before the Iron Age. It's when they used a lot of stone to do a lot of their tooling, but they became more advanced. So they weren't just settled in one place. They became advanced when it came to defense. They became advanced when it came to survival, food, all these different things. This is also around the time that, again, that Northern Africa was dried up. Now, I asked, now this came from my friend. I actually found out a little bit more about it from my friend who's from Kenya. And one of the things that he talked about is how amazingly advanced Africa was during this time compared to every other civilization in the world. They were so civilized that they were learning how to survive and thrive because of where they lived. Now, the people that went to the Middle East, the people that went to Europe, they were a little bit at a disadvantage because they didn't know their environment. Now, you could say the same thing if people that lived in Northern Africa and had to move because the green Northern Africa dried up. So they had to be more advanced for their area. So, yeah. What else did they do? They figured out how to live in other areas. So during this time, they went to places with a lot more jungle, while they used to be plains. And the people started to move more south. So the idea is that a lot of the people in this time period, even the Paleolithic, started more in the northern Africa. Because why? According to my friend James, he actually says, and I totally trust him, that in Kenya, it is like 85 to 90 degrees all year round. There's no need for AC, but there's also no need for heaters. I've never experienced that. I've always lived in more northern areas, whether it was Alaska, even Connecticut. California has a little bit like that, but it still has snow. It still has cold periods. But Africa, it stayed fairly settled. So why would everyone be in northern Africa? Because it was such a moderate climate and because it was so steady in the weather. And so not having to move allowed them to advance a little bit more quickly. But as we keep saying, Africa, the Sahara Desert probably dried up again, as well as we know, and they started to advance themselves. Now, this week, I'm only bringing this up, the prehistoric era, because there's not much information on there, and it's questionable. In our curriculum, you can actually read about all the different archaeological digs. You're also going to learn about the lessons you can learn from that. You can learn about a lot of different things that you would not actually think of beforehand. So I'm going to leave this up to you to find out more information. Read the curriculum and do your own studies. This is the thing that we promote, at least for this part, is to go out and do your own research. And we always ask you to do that. But find more information on a certain area. Find more things about a certain culture that is there. There is a few different cultures, but not much information is known about them. Why? Because there is no writing on it. And we can give names to cultures, but is it 100% exactly how we think it is? No, it's not. That's why for the prehistoric time, around 300 BC to about 4000 BC, I'm leaving it basically up to you. But before we leave, let's talk about some of the things that they did do that was advancements. Yesterday, we talked about the prehistoric drawings. These are some of the archaeological finds, ways that we know that they went after animals. We actually find other drawings of hunters. We also find them of domesticating animals. Again, this was around 4000 BC. Well, okay, sorry. Domesticating animals was about 5000 BC to about 3500 BC. And this is where they pinned up animals. They had herds that they would manage, like a herdsman with sheep. They did the same thing to other animals as well, including water buffalo, including and their species of water buffalo, elephants, and so forth. And so in this next period, this next week, we're going to be talking about some of the great advancements that they had. And this could actually be said was started here or there in Africa before anywhere else. Are we sure about this? No, we're not. Could it be? Yes, it could. So let's go into this. One thing that I do find interesting is take the comparison between the Paleolithic era and the Mesolithic era and the migration of people. We say that the people coming through the Bering Straits were so far back. But if Africa is the cradle of all existence, the question is, how did they get up to the Bering Straits so fast? That was a long, long way away. Why would they travel so far, so fast in order to get up there when there was so much land in the middle? And remember, the middle, yes, it might be hotter during the summer, but it usually stays at a fairly constant temperature, and people get used to it. The further north you get into the cold. Maybe people like the cold, but most people, if they're not experienced in it, they don't travel that quickly and move up north when it comes to just logically thinking of the people of prehistoric times. People that didn't have clothing. When they did get clothing, they didn't have really thick clothing. Then they had to get thicker clothing. And the farther and farther north they went. And then they crossed the Bering Straits. I don't question that probably did happen. I'm questioning about how much we actually understand about that time. So this is what we're going to be going through for a long time as we go through this, especially in the ancient civilization curriculum. We're not going to know everything. We're going to give you the best picture possible and let you move forward with what you know. But as we get further into history, like later dates, into the AD, 300 to 1600, we're going to have a lot more information for you. It might not be about individuals. We like to focus on individuals, but it will be when we get into the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Persian, the Byzantines, the Babylonians, the Romans. If we go over to China, we're going to be able to talk about certain people as we get later in the civilizations. But again, we're starting in Africa so we can get to that point. So thank you so much for joining me on this great adventure that is the Adventure Box podcast and we will catch you next time. Take care. Bye. If you have any comments or questions, add them to the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow, actually. Take care. Bye.